In popular imagination, the medieval assassin is a figure of mystery and excitement. Cloaked in darkness, armed with hidden blades, he appears as a lone figure in twisting alleys, striking down a target and then vanishing into the night. But the real life of those who carried out assassinations in the Middle Ages was nothing like the stories. It was not glamorous, not romantic, and certainly not safe. Instead, it was defined by hunger, fear, dirt, and the constant knowledge that one false step could mean a slow and ugly death. Assassins in the Middle Ages did not exist as a distinct profession. In most parts of Europe, they were not members of an elite guild with secret rituals, as novels and games often suggest. More often, they were men who lived on the margins of society, thieves, mercenaries, desperate retainers, or disillusioned soldiers who could be hired to do the jobs others refused to take. When a noble, a bishop, or a wealthy merchant wanted an enemy removed quietly, they sometimes turned to such figures. These assassins worked in shadows not because it was mysterious, but because exposure meant punishment beyond imagination. To kill in battle was lawful, to kill in the street was treachery. The most famous group associated with assassination in the Middle Ages were the Nizari Ismailis, often called the Assassins. In European chronicles, based in mountain fortresses across Persia and Syria, they became infamous in the 12th and 13th centuries for targeted killings of political and religious leaders. Chroniclers told stories of them appearing in broad daylight, striking their victims in crowded mosques or markets, and accepting death on the spot rather than fleeing. To their enemies, they seemed terrifying and fanatical. To their followers, they were disciplined instruments of survival in a hostile world. But even within this feared group, the reality of daily life was not one of constant intrigue, but of monotonous hardship. Castles perched on cliffs were difficult to supply. Food was often scarce, and constant threats of siege made life a cycle of waiting and enduring. Beyond such groups, the majority of medieval killers for hire were ordinary men forced into extraordinary risks. Some were disbanded soldiers after a war, men who had grown used to violence and could not find peaceful labor. Others were peasants drawn into the schemes of powerful lords, manipulated into killing rivals with promises of coin or protection. For most, assassination was not a calling, but a last resort. The payment might be enough to buy food or secure a small plot of land, but it rarely changed their lives for long. More often, it brought ruin. The tools of an assassin were unimpressive. Forget the hidden blades and clever poisons of modern stories. The reality was knives, daggers, and occasionally bows. Knives were easy to hide and quick to use, but they required close contact, which meant immense risk. Crossbows were feared for their power, but were harder to conceal, and carrying one through a town aroused suspicion. Poison existed, yes, but it was unreliable, difficult to obtain, and dangerous to use. Mixing herbs required knowledge, and mistakes could kill the user as easily as the target. Most assassins relied on surprise, not sophistication. They waited in doorways, in alleys, in crowds, and struck when the moment came. Life between assignments was no better. Assassins could not openly advertise their trade. They lived as beggars, vagrants, or mercenaries, moving from place to place. Suspicion clung to them. Trust was rare, because anyone could betray them to local authorities. Even their employers were often quick to deny them once the deed was done. Payment could be delayed, reduced, or withheld entirely, and the assassin had no court to appeal to. If he demanded justice, he risked exposure. In truth, the assassin was as expendable as the target. To make matters worse, the legal punishments for assassins were designed to terrify. In much of Europe, murderers could expect execution by hanging. But assassins, especially those caught killing nobles or church leaders, faced more elaborate deaths. Some were broken on the wheel, others burned, others mutilated before death. The spectacle was meant to send a clear message. No one should ever think of taking such a path. Even rumors of planning an assassination could lead to imprisonment or torture. Living with this constant risk, The assassin existed in a state of quiet dread, never sure if each job would be his last. The conditions of medieval towns only added to the misery. Streets were narrow and filthy, lined with refuse. Moving through them required blending with beggars, traders, or pilgrims. But every passerby was a potential informer. Markets were crowded, offering opportunity to strike unseen, but also greater chance of capture. To wait for a victim in such places meant enduring long hours of standing in mud. Pressed by strangers, stomach empty, nerves tense. Nights were worse. Darkness brought thieves and patrols alike, and anyone caught loitering could be questioned. An assassin's life was not one of romantic shadow, but of constant discomfort. Even within groups like the Nizaris, often portrayed as disciplined and elite, the recruits were mostly young men taken from poor families, indoctrinated with promises of paradise and duty. They lived under strict discipline, subject to commands that could send them to certain death. To refuse was unthinkable. To obey was often fatal. Their courage, celebrated by their leaders, meant little comfort when death came swiftly at the hands of guards or soldiers after a mission. So why did anyone choose this path? For many, choice was an illusion. Poverty, desperation, or coercion drove them. Some believed in causes greater than themselves, political, religious, or personal vengeance. Others hoped for quick wealth that rarely materialized. In the end, most assassins lived short lives, their names forgotten, their stories reduced to footnotes and chronicles written by the very elites. They had tried to strike down. When you imagine a medieval assassin, picture not the hero of a story, but a hungry, ragged man standing in the rain outside a city gate, clutching a worn dagger under his cloak, wondering if tonight will bring him the coin he was promised or the rope he fears. Picture him blending into the crowd, heart racing, not because of excitement, but because he knows that a single mistake means torture and death. This was not a life of adventure. It was a life of waiting, enduring, and fearing. And yet, the figure of the assassin endured in stories, passed down through fearful whispers and dramatic tales. Nobles and kings exaggerated their menace, chroniclers painted them as devils, and centuries later, their memory became romanticized. But beneath all the stories lies the quieter, sadder truth. To be a medieval assassin was to live in constant danger, to suffer hunger and cold, to risk everything for little reward. It was not a glorious calling. It was a desperate gamble against fate. As we leave this first glimpse into their world, one must wonder, what did it truly feel like, day after day, to live on the edge of society, carrying a trade that everyone despised yet secretly needed? Did the assassin believe he was feared, or did he simply feel alone, expendable, and forgotten? While the image of the assassin has often been shaped by imagination, it is in the details of their tools and methods that the harsh reality becomes clear. The weapons they carried were not the sleek, hidden marvels of fiction, but the simple and often clumsy instruments of their time. The dagger was the most common tool, a short blade that could be concealed under clothing and used quickly at close range. It was the same sort of blade that a farmer might use for cutting rope or slaughtering an animal. Not a weapon designed for elegance, but for utility. To approach a target with such a weapon required absolute closeness, and closeness meant risk. The assassin had to place himself within arm's reach of his victim, with no certainty that the strike would be fatal and every chance that guards or bystanders would respond immediately. Poison was sometimes imagined as a more refined method, yet in practice it was unreliable and dangerous. True poisons were rare, costly, and difficult to prepare. Most who attempted their use relied on mixtures of herbs, spoiled food, or strong wine to overwhelm a victim. More often than not, the results were slow, uncertain, or mistaken for illness. To slip poison into a goblet or platter required access to kitchens or servants, which few assassins possessed. The tales of entire courts being poisoned by a single clever assassin are largely legend. In truth, most attempts failed, and those who tried often perished themselves, either from mishandling the poison or from discovery before the act could be completed. Crossbows and bows were another option, offering distance and speed. But they were hardly discreet. A crossbow was bulky, noisy, and slow to load. Carrying one through a city would have marked the assassin instantly. Bows required skill and strength, and even then they could misfire or miss. To shoot in a crowded street meant risking hitting the wrong person, and to strike an open countryside meant escape was difficult. The assassin who relied on such tools often had only a single chance, and if it failed, he faced the wrath of guards, townsfolk, or soldiers. The method most relied upon was patience. An assassin might wait for hours, even days. In a narrow alley, a churchyard, or outside a town gate, he had to blend in as a beggar, a laborer, or a pilgrim, hiding his true intent. In rain, in mud, in the stink of streets, he watched and waited, never knowing if his chance would come. Hunger gnawed at him, fatigue dulled his senses, and the longer he waited, the greater the chance that someone would notice his lingering presence. When at last the target appeared, the assassin had only moments to act. A slip, a stumble, or a cry could undo everything. The act itself was rarely clean. A dagger thrust into cloth might catch on fabric, a blow might land poorly, and instead of swift silence there could be struggle, shouting, and blood. In such moments the assassin's fate was sealed. If he was not killed on the spot, he was dragged before authorities, tortured for the names of his employers, and executed in public. Death was certain, and it was designed to be painful. No assassin could expect mercy. Even when a killing succeeded, the assassin's troubles did not end. Payment was uncertain. For those who ordered such deeds often feared exposure. They might refuse to pay, or worse, silence the assassin themselves. The man who killed for hire was not trusted. He was useful only until the deed was done, and then he was dangerous. To know too much was to invite betrayal. Many assassins lived their short lives always watching over their shoulder, suspecting that today's employer might be tomorrow's executioner. Travel added to the misery. Assassins had no fixed home, for a known place of residence meant discovery. They drifted along roads, slept in barns, begged at monasteries, and moved constantly. Roads in the Middle Ages were perilous. Bandits prowled them. Wolves sometimes lurked at their edges, and weather made travel exhausting. To move by night was to stumble through mud and darkness. To move by day was to risk recognition. Hunger was constant, for coin was scarce, and inns were too expensive for such men. Cold nights and wet clothing were companions more faithful than any comrade. The physical toll was matched by the mental one. To live as an assassin was to live in solitude, for friendship meant danger. Few dared to trust such men, and few such men trusted others. Loneliness pressed heavily, broken only by fleeting encounters with strangers who knew nothing of their true trade. Some sought comfort in drink, others in fleeting pleasures, but these only deepened their misery. Faith, too, was complicated. The church condemned murder, yet some assassins convinced themselves that their deeds served a greater good. Others abandoned faith entirely, seeing only a world of survival and betrayal. What stories tell us daring adventures were, in truth, miserable labors marked by fear, hunger, betrayal, and short lives. Assassins were not masters of their craft, but pawns in games of power. They struck when ordered, endured the risk, and often perished in obscurity. Their methods were crude, their tools simple, their rewards meager. And yet, despite the danger, the figure of the assassin persisted. There was always someone willing to pay for a rival's death, and always someone desperate enough to take the risk. The need for such figures never vanished, even if the individuals themselves rarely lived long enough to be remembered. So one must ask, when the assassin waited in a shadowed alley, gripping a knife with shaking hands, did he feel powerful? Or did he simply feel trapped, another forgotten man gambling his life for a handful of coins? The fate of the medieval assassin was almost always the same: short-lived, brutal, and overshadowed by the very powers that had used him. Few assassins ever grew old, and fewer still ever found peace. Their trade existed in the shadows of politics and power, and shadows were a dangerous place to live. Once the deed was done, an assassin became less an asset and more a liability. He had knowledge that could be dangerous, and he had no shield of honor, no guild to defend him, and no church to grant absolution. He lived outside the rules of society, and so society had no reason to protect him when the moment of reckoning arrived. Execution was the most common end. If caught before or after the act, the assassin faced not a simple death, but one meant to terrify others. Public hangings, burnings, and even dismemberments awaited those who confessed or were forced to confess under torture. The process of interrogation was rarely about truth. It was about spectacle and fear. Authorities wanted to know who had hired the assassin, but they also wanted to show the crowd that such men would not be tolerated. The assassin's suffering became a performance, a lesson carved into flesh for others to witness. Some assassins escaped the noose or the pyre, but escape was not salvation. Those who survived long enough often found themselves abandoned by their employers, unable to settle anywhere for fear of recognition. They wandered until hunger or illness ended their days. To imagine the assassin as a figure of wealth and ease is to misunderstand his place in the medieval world. The pay was uncertain, and even when delivered, it rarely amounted to more than what a laborer might earn through months of toil. The promise of coin tempted men, but the reality was disappointment and danger. There were exceptions, but even those serve as cautionary tales. A few assassins rose in notoriety, remembered because of the power of those they struck down. Yet their names are known less because they triumphed and more because their deeds shocked. Chroniclers. To be remembered was not necessarily to be honored. In fact, most assassins passed unnamed into the soil, forgotten except for a line in a legal record or a passing mention in a monk's chronicle. Their deaths were as anonymous as their lives, and the world moved on without pause. The organizations most often associated with medieval assassination, such as the famed sect sometimes referred to in Western accounts as the Assassins of the Middle East, occupy a different place in the imagination. To Western chroniclers, they seemed exotic, dangerous, and strangely disciplined, their supposed use of hashish and secret oaths giving rise to legends. Yet the truth was again more practical and far less glamorous. They were part of a broader network of survival, using targeted killings as a strategy in a time when warfare and intrigue were constant. Their lives were not those of romanticized figures slipping unseen through palaces, but of men, working under strict orders, prepared to die for their cause. Even among them, the fate was grim, for their role was not chosen out of glory, but necessity. As time passed, the methods of assassination changed. With the slow development of gunpowder weapons, the possibility of striking from greater distance altered the assassin's role. But it did not remove the misery. Firearms were loud, conspicuous, and unreliable. The man who fired a shot in a crowded street might succeed in killing his target, but had little chance of escape. Thus, even as technology advanced, the assassin remained a figure whose life expectancy was short and whose reputation was grim. And yet, society could never entirely rid itself of such figures. Kings, nobles, and rivals continued to seek their services when desperation or ambition demanded. It was easier to pay one desperate man with a dagger than to raise an army. But every employer knew the truth. Once an assassin had served his purpose, he was no longer useful. The cycle repeated endlessly: hire, use, discard. The assassin's life was, at its core, one of disposability. Reflecting on their fate, one might consider what drove men into this shadow trade at all. Poverty, desperation, or coercion were often the roots. Few would have chosen it freely, and those who did may have been blinded by promises of reward or notions of power. Yet power was never truly theirs. They were instruments wielded by others, and when the task was done, the hand that held them simply let them fall. In this way, the assassin serves as a reminder of the harsh realities of the medieval world. For all the myths of gallant knights and noble lords, there existed a parallel world of desperation, where survival demanded choices that left little room for honor. The assassin's dagger was as much a tool of the world as the plow or the hammer. Though far more feared, his story is not one of triumph but of caution, showing how human lives were used and discarded by larger forces. And so, when we look back upon the assassin of the Middle Ages, stripped of legend and romance, we see not a figure of power, but of fragility. His life was not one of freedom, but of constant danger, mistrust, and misery. His death was not heroic, but often slow and public, meant to erase whatever shadow he had once cast. He remains an emblem of a past where violence was common, where desperation shaped choices, and where those who walked in shadows found themselves swallowed by them. Yet even in this bleakness, one question lingers. If so many met such grim ends, why did others still rise to take their place, knowing the fate that almost certainly awaited them? In the Middle Ages, before the printing press spread across Europe, every book was a handmade object. Every page of parchment, every letter written in ink, and every tiny mark of punctuation had to be crafted by human hands. Those hands belonged most often to scribes, men who spent their lives hunched over wooden desks, quills in hand, copying line after line of text by candlelight. For some, this work was part of a religious calling. For others, it was simply survival. Yet in either case, the task was slow, repetitive, and often exhausting, requiring patience beyond measure and endurance that few today can easily imagine. The path to becoming a scribe was not simple. In many cases, it began with a boy entering a monastery or cathedral school at a young age. Here he learned the basics of Latin, the language of most written texts in medieval Europe. Hours were spent memorizing prayers, passages of scripture, and the structure of grammar. Writing was a skill taught through endless repetition, scratching letters on wax tablets with a stylus, or later, on scraps of parchment with crude pens, to form letters evenly, to space words consistently, to avoid smudging ink or miscopying words. These were lessons drilled into young students. Through constant correction, a single slip could mean punishment, and every mistake reminded the learner of the seriousness of his craft. The tools of the scribe were themselves reminders of how laborious the task was. Parchment was made from animal skins, calf, sheep, or goat stretched, scraped, and treated until smooth enough to take ink. It was costly, and its preparation required long hours of unpleasant work. Ink was usually made from oak galls, mixed with iron salts and gum, producing a dark liquid that could corrode a pen or stain a hand permanently. The quills came from geese or swans, hardened by heat and trimmed carefully to produce a fine nib. Each tool demanded care, and each could fail at the worst possible moment. A quill might split in the middle of a sentence, ink might blot and ruin a line, or parchment might tear after hours of careful copying. There were no shortcuts, only patience. The scriptorium, the room where scribes worked, was rarely comfortable. In monasteries, it was often a plain chamber with wooden desks, narrow windows, and the smell of wax and ink lingering in the air. Light was precious, for candles were costly, and natural light was limited by the seasons. In winter, hours of daylight were short, and men worked hunched in the dim glow of lamps, straining their eyes to see each letter clearly. Cold drafts seeped through stone walls, chilling fingers and stiffening joints. In summer, heat and flies added to the misery, and sweat blurred the ink. Silence was demanded, broken only by the scratch of quills and the occasional cough. The work was repetitive, and time passed slowly. But repetition was the essence of the task. A single large manuscript could take months or even years to complete. A Bible, with its hundreds of pages, was often the labor of many scribes, each assigned to portions of text, their handwriting carefully matched for consistency. Mistakes were inevitable, and correction was itself a delicate art. To scrape a letter from parchment required a sharp knife and a steady hand, and even then, the trace of the error remained faintly visible. To blot ink across a line was a disaster, one that might mean discarding a whole sheet of parchment. The constant threat of error weighed heavily, making each stroke of the quill a quiet test of discipline. Not all scribes were monks. In towns and cities, lay scribes found work copying legal documents, charters, and contracts. They worked for kings, nobles, merchants, or courts, and their tasks were no less tedious. Instead of sacred texts, they wrote deeds of land, lists of taxes, records of judgments, and accounts of trade. The labor was still long and the mistakes just as costly. A misplaced word and a charter could change the meaning of ownership, sparking disputes that might last for years. In such cases, the blame often fell on the scribe, who could face punishment for his error. The stakes were high, but the pay was often low, leaving many scribes in a cycle of endless toil for little reward. The hours were long. Sunrise to sunset could be spent at the desk, with breaks only for meals or prayer. In winter, the cold made the ink stiffen, the quill brittle, and the hand shake. In summer, sweat dripped on the parchment, and insects crawled across the desks. To keep a steady pace required not just skill but sheer endurance. Eyes strained, backs ached, and fingers cramped. Yet the work continued. There was always another line to copy, another margin to fill, another letter to perfect. The progress was slow, but the pressure to finish never eased. And through it all, the scribe rarely had a sense of personal achievement. His name might never appear in the manuscript. His labor was anonymous, swallowed into the greater whole. If he added a small note at the end of colophon, expressing relief at finishing, it was often the only trace of his existence. Here ends the book. Thanks be to God, some scribes wrote. And one can hear in such words the exhaustion behind the page. To spend months or years on a task and leave behind no recognition was the quiet reality of the profession. Books were rare, and their scarcity made them valuable, yet the men who made them were not celebrated. They were tools of preservation, guardians of knowledge whose own lives passed unremarked. Their work sustained the memory of civilizations, yet their names were forgotten. To read a medieval manuscript today is to glimpse the quiet labor of countless men whose existence was defined by ink, parchment, and silence. And so one must wonder, as a scribe dipped his quill once more into ink and bent over the parchment, did he find comfort in the thought that his words preserved something greater than himself? Or did he simply feel the weight of another endless day of copying with no end in sight? The life of a scribe was bound not just by the work itself, but by the rules that governed it. In monasteries, the scriptorium was often one of the most strictly regulated spaces, for its purpose was considered sacred. The copying of holy texts was seen as a service to God, and every aspect of the process was infused with discipline. Silence was demanded, not only to prevent distraction, but also to maintain the solemnity of the task. To speak without necessity was frowned upon, and in some scriptoria, punishable. The scratching of quills and the faint rustle of parchment became the constant background, a soundscape of devotion mixed with drudgery. The day was divided by bells, calling monks to prayer at regular intervals. Work was punctuated by these moments of ritual, when scribes would set down their pens, leave the chamber, and chant psalms in the chapel. Yet for many, the return to the desk was as inevitable as the rising of the sun. Hours stretched on, broken only by meals and prayers, until the light waned and the last candle guttered. Even then, the work was never truly finished. There was always another text to copy, another commission to fulfill, another book demanded by abbots, bishops, or patrons. The monotony was immense, line after line, page after page. Each letter demanded care. A simple alphabet had to be written thousands upon thousands of times across a manuscript. Unlike modern writing, where words can flow with relative speed, medieval script demanded precision in every curve and stroke. Certain scripts, such as Carolingian minuscule or Gothic textura, required tight uniformity. Letters had to stand evenly, spacing had to be exact, and decorative flourishes had to be consistent. A lapse of attention could spoil a whole page. For the scribe, the labor was not only mental, but physical, requiring constant posture and minute control of the hand. The body suffered greatly under such strain. Hunched over desks for hours, scribes developed chronic pain in their backs and necks. Their eyes, straining at small letters in poor light, grew weary and sometimes permanently damaged. Hands cramped from holding quills at awkward angles, while the constant repetition of strokes produced aches that lingered long after the day's work ended. The discomfort was accepted as part of the vocation, endured quietly without complaint. After all, to preserve God's word or the laws of a kingdom was considered a higher calling than personal comfort. Yet not all scribes worked out of devotion. In towns and cities, professional scribes worked under the watchful eyes of employers who demanded efficiency above all else. Legal scribes, for instance, had to copy court documents, property transfers, and charters with exact precision. The stakes here were not simply embarrassing. They could cause lawsuits, disputes, or the loss of valuable property. Employers often provided strict oversight, and the fear of error loomed constantly. The pressure added another weight to an already burdensome trade. To combat fatigue, scribes sometimes used little tricks. They chewed herbs to keep themselves alert, stretched their hands during pauses, or shifted positions when no one was looking. Some added small personal touches to their work, tiny doodles in margins or playful notes at the end of a manuscript. These moments of human expression and irritated comment about the cold, a plea for wine, a sigh of relief at finishing a page reveal the weary humanity behind the formal lines of ink. They were reminders that even in the midst of monotony, men found small ways to voice their feelings. But such moments were rare. The scribe's task remained, above all, one of repetition. Each day resembled the one before, each page another in a seemingly endless sequence. Time was measured not by events but by the slow filling of parchment, the gradual completion of folios, the binding of gatherings into volumes. To work as a scribe was to live in a cycle of sameness, where the outside world seemed distant, reduced to faint noises through the stone walls of the monastery or the hum of a marketplace beyond a town office. The mental toll was profound. Some scribes wrestled with boredom, their minds wandering even as their hands repeated the familiar motions. Others found solace in the steadiness, treating the repetition as a form of meditation. But for many, the long hours in dim light, the silence, and the strain led to weariness that dulled the spirit. Fatigue could lead to mistakes, and mistakes meant reprimand or worse. The balance between focus and exhaustion was fragile, and every day tested it anew still. Despite the hardship, the work had meaning. Books were rare treasures, and the creation of even one manuscript meant knowledge preserved, scripture secured, or laws recorded for generations to come. A scribe might never see the full impact of his labor, but his words could travel across centuries. This thought, perhaps, gave some comfort, and yet, one must wonder how often the individual scribe felt the weight of that purpose. Compared to the immediate weight of another long day at the desk, the grind was ceaseless, and the scribe's life was defined by it. He did not choose when to rest, nor what to write, nor how long to continue. He bent over his parchment because that was his duty, because that was what the world demanded of him. His voice was silent, his presence invisible, his labor constant. He was, in many ways, a ghost even in his own time, seen only in the pages he filled, not in the lives he lived. And so the question lingers as candlelight flickered across stone walls, and the faint sound of scratching quills filled the air. Did the scribe see himself as a vessel of something eternal, or as a weary man bound to endless repetition, with no relief in sight? The legacy of the medieval scribe is a quiet one, woven into the very fabric of history, yet rarely celebrated. Without their labors, countless texts would have been lost, from sacred scriptures to ancient philosophy, from legal codes to medical treatises. Their long hours bent over desks ensured that ideas survived across centuries, transmitted one letter at a time. Yet, the very anonymity of their work meant that while the books endured, the men behind them faded into obscurity. The ink recorded words, but rarely the names of the hands that guided the quill. For many scribes, This anonymity was simply the nature of the task. Their role was not to invent, but to preserve, not to speak, but to echo. They were vessels of continuity, carrying forward traditions that might otherwise have vanished. And yet, behind every book was a body bent in labor, an eye strained in dim light, a hand cramped from repetition. The quiet endurance of these men sustained the intellectual and spiritual life of the Middle Ages, even if history seldom paused to recognize them. The coming of the printing press in the 15th century marked a turning point that forever changed their world. When Johannes Gutenberg and his contemporaries developed movable type, the labor of weeks or months could be condensed into days. Pages could be reproduced with a speed and consistency no team of scribes could match. For the first time, books could be produced in numbers that made them accessible beyond the wealthiest institutions. The age of manuscript culture gave way to the age of print, and with it, the scribe's profession began to vanish. For those who had spent lifetimes copying texts, the arrival of the press must have been a strange and unsettling event. Their craft, so carefully honed, was suddenly less valued. The meticulous training, the discipline of forming letters, the endless repetition all seemed to belong to an era that was slipping away. Some monasteries continued to maintain scriptoria for a time, but increasingly, printed books took their place. The scribe became a figure of the past, remembered mostly in the manuscripts themselves, relics of a slower, more painstaking age. Yet the printing press did not erase their importance. Without the centuries of labor that preceded it, there would have been fewer texts to print. The works of ancient authors, the traditions of theology, the records of law all had to be copied by hand. In order to survive long enough for printing to preserve them, the press multiplied books, but the scribe had safeguarded them through centuries when loss was always possible. Fire, flood, neglect, or simple decay threatened parchment. But the constant labor of scribes ensured that another copy often existed elsewhere. They were the unseen guardians of continuity, bridging the fragile gap between antiquity and the modern world. Still, the human reality of their lives remained harsh. The image of the scribe as a guardian of knowledge is inspiring, but the daily truth was often dreary. Cold chambers, stiff backs, weary eyes, and the monotony of endless copying defined their days. Few left behind anything beyond the books themselves. Occasionally, a marginal note breaks through the silence. In one manuscript, a scribe wrote, "As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe." In another, one confessed simply, "This parchment is very hairy." These fragments reveal both humor and fatigue, small glimpses of the human voice is otherwise lost. Beneath the lines of text, when one reads these notes today, there is a sense of connection across centuries. The scribe who complained about the cold, who longed for wine, who sighed with relief at finishing his task, was not so different from anyone who has endured repetitive labor. The boredom, the discomfort, the small moments of wood all remind us that these were ordinary men, living ordinary struggles, even as they performed extraordinary work. In time, the manuscripts they produced became treasured objects, illuminated pages, with their brilliant colors and intricate designs, came to symbolize the height of medieval artistry. Yet even here, the labor was divided. The scribe copied the words, while an illuminator added decoration, and a binder assembled the whole. The book was a collective object, shaped by many hands, most of which remain nameless. For every magnificent illuminated Bible, there were dozens of plain manuscripts, unadorned and utilitarian, produced by scribes whose work was purely functional. These books were no less important, but they rarely drew admiration. They served their purpose quietly, just as their makers lived quietly. The decline of the scribe's role did not erase the conditions that had shaped them. Long hours of repetitive work remained common in many trades, whether in weaving, farming, or other crafts. What made the scribe unique was the weight of preservation, the knowledge that each line mattered, even if he felt the burden of monotony more than the pride of achievement. His task was part of a larger chain that kept history alive. The paradox of his life was that it was both profoundly important and profoundly invisible. And so, when we reflect on the grind of the scribe, we see both the endurance of the human spirit and the quiet cost of history's progress. We inherit their work every time we read a text that survived the Middle Ages. Even if we do not know their names, their exhaustion remains hidden, their aches unrecorded, their sighs unheard. What we see are the words they copied, steady and precise, as if time itself flowed smoothly through their hands. The printing press may have ended their trade, but it also ensured that their efforts were not in vain. By multiplying what they had preserved, it gave permanence to their temporary lives. And yet, one final question lingers. When the last scribe in a monastery laid down his quill and saw the world turning toward print, did he feel relief that the grind was over, or sorrow that his craft, which had consumed his life, was vanishing into silence? The life of a gong farmer in the Middle Ages was one of the most unpleasant occupations imaginable. Yet it was also absolutely essential to the functioning of towns and cities. To understand their place in history, you must imagine the medieval town, as it truly was not the romantic picture of cobbled streets and half-timbered houses, but a place where thousands of people lived in close quarters without anything resembling modern sanitation. Waste had to go somewhere, and in most cases it went into pits dug beneath latrines, cesspools behind houses, or shared privies for the community. These pits would gradually fill, and someone had to empty them. That someone was the gong farmer. The word gong itself was a Middle English term meaning dung or excrement. The job of the gong farmer was therefore the farming of filth, the harvesting of human waste from the dark pits where it accumulated. They usually worked at night, partly because the smell was unbearable in the heat of the day, and partly because the sight of their work was too much for ordinary people to bear. Carrying buckets of waste through the narrow streets was not a spectacle that anyone wanted to see, and so the task was consigned to the hours of darkness when the town slept, and the gong farmer carried out his duty in silence. The job was not one of choice. Few men willingly entered into this profession. In many cases, it was the poor, the desperate, or those with no other prospects who became gong farmers. Some were forced into it because they could not find other work, and others inherited the trade, for there were families who for generations handled the cleaning of cesspits. Whatever the reason, it was a job that marked a man for life. The stench clung to him, making him unwelcome in taverns, markets, or even in churches. People recognized the gong farmer not only by the clothes he wore, but by the odor that no amount of washing could entirely remove. Payment for the work varied, but it was not as low as one might imagine, because few people were willing to take on such a revolting occupation. Those who did could demand better wages than a simple laborer. Some gong farmers became relatively well off, able to earn more in a night as labor than others might earn in several days of toil in the fields. Yet wealth could not wash away the stigma. They might have had coin in their pockets, but they were still avoided in company, their very presence considered offensive. The paradox of their lives was that they were needed by all and shunned by all. To perform their work, gong farmers used simple tools, buckets, ropes, and sometimes shovels or long-handled scoops. They descended into the pits, often climbing down ladders slick with filth, and filled their buckets with the waste that had accumulated over weeks or months. The contents were hauled up and carried away, usually to the edge of town where the waste could be dumped into fields. In this, the gong farmers played a role in fertilizing crops, for the human waste was spread on farmland to enrich the soil. The cycle of filth thus returned to the cycle of food, a reality of medieval life that few wished to dwell upon, but which sustained agriculture nonetheless. The dangers of the job were real. Cesspits were not just unpleasant, they were hazardous. The buildup of noxious gases such as methane and hydrogen sulfide could suffocate a man if he lingered too long below. There are records of gong farmers collapsing in the pits, overcome by fumes, sometimes dying before they could be pulled out. The physical strain of hauling heavy buckets in the dark, in cramped and slippery conditions, was immense. Cuts or wounds carried the risk of infection, for the filth carried disease. In a time when medical knowledge was limited and treatments were rudimentary, such infections could be deadly. To be a gong farmer was to live with constant risk, and many did not live long. The work also left its mark on the body in subtler ways. Skin exposed to the filth could develop sores. The lungs, breathing in the damp, fetid air of the pits, might be weakened over years of labor. And always there was the smell, seeping in the skin, hair, and clothing. Some accounts suggest that gong farmers were required by law to live outside the town walls, both for practical reasons and because no one wished to have them as neighbors. The separation reinforced their status as outcasts, tolerated only because of the service they provided. Despite their low status, gong farmers were occasionally mentioned in official records, often in the context of complaints about sanitation. Town authorities were concerned with the cleanliness of streets, not out of concern for public health in the modern sense, but because of the nuisance and discomfort of foul smells. Ordinances required that cesspits be emptied regularly, and gong farmers were contracted to do so. In London, for example, records from the 15th century note the employment of gong farmers by the city, paid to remove waste and transport it to the dung heaps outside the walls. Their work was hidden, but without it, the city would have become unbearable. The perception of cleanliness in the medieval world was very different from today. People did not understand germs or bacteria, but they did understand stench, and stench was thought to be unhealthy. The miasma theory, the belief that foul air caused disease, meant that gong farmers were not only removing waste, but also combating what was believed to be a source of sickness. Though they did not intend it, their work contributed in some measure to the control of disease. Even if their methods were crude, yet for the gong farmer himself, such notions mattered little. His world was one of toil in the darkness, of buckets filled with filth, of streets traversed under the moonlight while the rest of the town slept. His companions were few, his social circle limited, his occupation spoken of in whispers. Children might laugh at him, and adults might avoid him, but when their own privies filled, they called upon him nonetheless. He bore the contradiction of being both despised and needed, an invisible servant of public life. Occasionally, their work intersected with larger events. During outbreaks of plague, for example, waste removal became even more urgent as fear of contagion grew. Gong farmers continued their duties, sometimes at great personal risk, for no one else would handle the task. Their presence during such times, silent and overlooked, reminds us that history's great events were not only shaped by kings and armies, but also by men working in darkness with buckets of filth. Without them, the cities could not have endured. As you imagine this world, picture a man climbing down into a pit on a cold night, the torchlight flickering against damp walls, the air thick with foulness. He fills a bucket, ties it to a rope, and signals for it to be hauled up. Again and again, he repeats the motion, his body weary, his hands slick, his breath short. When the pit is emptied, he climbs back into the night, carrying his load through the silent streets, past houses where others sleep in comfort. He is alone, yet essential. He will return again when the pit is full, for that is the cycle of his labor, endless and thankless. The question that lingers is not whether his work mattered, for without it towns would have collapsed under their own waste, but rather how he endured such a life. Was it the promise of wages, the hope of survival, the lack of other options? Or did some few perhaps find a kind of grim pride in doing the job that no one else would? The daily reality of the gong farmer was shaped by a rhythm that few others in medieval society shared. While most people's lives revolve around daylight, the opening of market stalls in the morning, the tolling of church bells through the day, and the gathering of families around hearths at night, the gong farmer worked in reverse. His labor began when others withdrew. At dusk, as townsfolk bolted their doors, the gong farmer made his way toward the cesspits. Lantern in hand, rope coiled at his side, bucket swinging heavily, he disappeared into the parts of the town where filth had quietly accumulated out of sight. and out of mind. The first task was always to assess the pit. Some were shallow and easy to reach, others deep and treacherous. Cesspits could be dug beneath latrine houses, under floors, or at the edges of courtyards. Sometimes, makeshift structures concealed them. Other times, they were open and crude. The gong farmer would lift a cover, let down his lantern, and see how far the contents had risen. If the waste had hardened near the top, it would need to be broken up before removal. If it was liquid, the task would be messier still. He climbed down slowly, careful not to slip, for a fall into such a pit could be as deadly as any battlefield wound. Once inside, the work was grueling. Each bucket had to be filled by hand. Some men used a scoop or shovel, but more often it was a matter of bending, reaching, and hauling. The smell was overwhelming. Those who endured this work regularly may have become accustomed to it in a dull sense, but it could never be ignored. The air was heavy with gases that stung the eyes and throat. A gong farmer might tie a cloth over his nose and mouth, but the protection was limited. Every breath carried the risk of dizziness, and fainting in a cesspit often meant death before rescue could arrive. Above ground, an assistant or apprentice hauled the buckets out. These were then loaded into carts, sometimes lined with straw to absorb the worst of the sloshing contents. From there, the load was carried through the town toward the dumping grounds. The journey itself was dangerous, not only because of the weight of the buckets, but because of the reactions of those who encountered them. Even at night, some townsfolk were still awake, guards on watch, bakers preparing ovens, brewers tending vats. A cart of waste was an unwelcome sight. Stones might be thrown, curses shouted, insults hurled. The gong farmer kept his eyes down and walked on, for confrontation brought nothing but more trouble. When the loads reached the outskirts, they were often dumped into designated pits, or onto fields where the waste would serve as fertilizer. This connection between filth and food was an uneasy truth of medieval life. Human waste enriched the soil, which in turn nourished crops, which sustained the very people who shunned the gong farmer. It was a cycle few wished to acknowledge, but one that kept communities alive. Farmers tolerated the presence of gong farmers when they arrived at night, spreading their loads on fallow fields. By morning, the work was hidden, and life carried on. For the gong farmer himself, however, there was no hiding from the stigma. His clothes carried the scent of his labor, and though he might wash in rivers or streams after a night's work, the odor clung stubbornly. People crossed the street to avoid him. In markets, sellers might refuse to stand beside him. Some churches even barred gong farmers from worship during crowded services, claiming their presence disturbed the congregation. It was not simply the smell, but the association waste was impure, and by handling it, the gong farmer became marked as impure himself. His labor kept the community clean, yet he was branded unclean. This social isolation meant that gong farmers often formed their own small communities. Families of gong farmers lived together, their children inheriting the trade. In some towns, they were even required by law to reside on the outskirts, near the dumping grounds, so that the smell did not mingle with the rest of the population. Such segregation reinforced their status as outsiders. Within their own households, however, they lived like any others, eating bread and broth, tending small gardens, and raising children. Their lives were ordinary in many respects, except for the work that defined them to the outside world. The economic reality added another layer of complexity. Gong farmers earned more than many unskilled laborers. A man who spent one night emptying a cesspit could be paid the equivalent of several days. Wages for a field hand. In some cases, especially in large towns where cesspits filled quickly, the work was steady and profitable. This wealth, however, did not buy respect. A gong farmer might have money to spend, but shopkeepers hesitated to serve him, and tavern owners might quietly refuse him entry. Wealth without social acceptance meant that the money often remained at home, used to secure better food for the family or to bribe officials into granting favorable contracts. It could not purchase dignity. The risks of disease haunted their work as well. While medieval people did not understand contagion as we do today, they did recognize that those who worked with waste often fell ill. Sores, fevers, and sudden deaths were not uncommon among Gong farmers. The connection was noted, even if the cause was poorly understood. In times of plague, when fear ran high, Gong farmers faced suspicion that they carried or spread the sickness. Yet paradoxically, they were also needed more than ever, for privies had to be cleaned lest the stench overwhelm entire districts. This double burden being feared as carriers and yet required as workers made their place in society even more precarious. Some records show small glimpses of their lives in moments of human weakness or humor. A scribe in London once wrote of a Gong farmer who, weary of insults, retorted to an angry customer that without him the man would drown in his own dung. Another account tells of a Gong farmer who drowned while at work, his fellows pulling his lifeless body from a pit as townsfolk looked on in horrified fascination. Such incidents were reminders of the ever-present danger of their occupation, but also of how easily tragedy was shrugged off when it happened to those on society as margins. Their invisibility in written history is striking. Chroniclers wrote of kings, bishops, and battles, but seldom of the men who kept the streets livable. Only in official ordinances and court records do Gong farmers appear, usually in complaints about smells or in contracts for waste removal. Their voices are almost entirely lost, save for the rare anecdote or bitter remark passed down secondhand. And yet, every medieval town had them. They were as much a part of daily life as bakers, smiths, or merchants, even if their names never appeared in the annals. The quiet persistence of their work points to a broader truth about history, that it is sustained not only by grand figures but by those who carried burdens no one else wished to bear. The Gong farmer, invisible and despised, nonetheless held together the fragile fabric of urban life. Without his buckets, his carts, his nightly journeys, the cesspits would have overflowed, the stench would have spread unchecked, and disease would have thrived even more than it already did. His labor was thankless, but it was indispensable. Still, one cannot help but wonder how the Gong farmer himself felt. Did he accept the stigma as unchangeable, or did he feel bitterness toward the townsfolk who scorned him? Did he comfort himself with the wages, or did he feel the weight of the insults more heavily than the weight of his buckets? These questions linger unanswered, for the men themselves left no memoirs, no diaries, no accounts of their thoughts. They are ghosts in the historical record, present only through the work they performed. And so, as you think of them now, trudging through darkened streets with their carts of filth, remember that their burden was more than physical. It was the burden of living on the edge of society, of being essential but never respected, of enduring night after night in service of a world that turned its face away from them. The grime and the smell were real enough, but the loneliness may have been the heavier weight. Was the money enough to make it bearable? Or did every step through the silent streets remind them of how far apart they stood from the rest of their world? The Gong farmer's profession did not vanish overnight, but its decline was inevitable once new approaches to sanitation began to take hold. In the early modern period, by the 17th and 18th centuries, cities were growing larger, populations denser, and the problem of human waste more pressing than ever. Town authorities began experimenting with more systematic waste removal, creating larger cesspits, drains, and eventually sewer systems that made the nightly labors of the Gong farmer less necessary. Slowly, their role diminished, absorbed into broader urban infrastructure, until they became a relic of the medieval world, remembered mainly for the filth they carried. The transition did not happen evenly across Europe. In some towns, cesspits continued to be used for centuries, and Gong farmers continued their rounds under different names, sometimes called nightmen or scavengers. They were still seen in the back alleys of London well into the 17th century, emptying pits and carting their loads out beyond the walls. But even as the job persisted, it was no longer central. Engineers and city planners began to speak of underground sewers, pipes and flowing water. Dreams that would only become reality in the 19th century. The gong farmer, once indispensable, became increasingly marginal. For the men themselves, this shift must have been met with mixed feelings. On the one hand, the decline of the trade meant the loss of a steady income, a source of livelihood for families who had done the work for generations. On the other hand, the stigma and hardship of the labor were such that few would have mourned its disappearance. One imagines that those who lived to see the new systems of sanitation emerge may have felt a kind of relief, even if it meant the end of their profession. They had carried the burden of filth long enough, and the world was moving on. Yet in reflecting on their place in history, it becomes clear that the gong farmer's contribution was far greater than the immediate task of emptying cesspits. They sustained the possibility of urban life. Medieval towns were fragile ecosystems, vulnerable to disease, fire, famine, and disorder. Without someone to manage waste, the pressure of so many people living in close quarters would have become intolerable. It was the unseen labor of gong farmers that allowed towns to remain habitable. Their nightly journeys, their endless buckets, their silent toil in the dark kept cities functioning long enough for new solutions to be invented. The irony of their existence is that they embodied the very contradictions of medieval society. They were essential, yet despised. They were well paid compared to many, yet forced to live apart. They preserved the health of others, yet were considered unclean themselves. The gong farmer was both a figure of disgust and a figure of necessity, tolerated only because his absence would have been catastrophic. That tension defined their lives, shaping not only their social standing but also the memory or lack of memory that history has preserved. Today, when we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine knights, castles, and cathedrals. Rarely do we pause to consider the cesspits beneath those same towns, or the men who descended into them. Yet without gong farmers, the glittering courts and bustling markets would have drowned in their own waste. They were the invisible scaffolding of medieval life, holding up the structure that others built upon. Their work was not heroic in the traditional sense, but it was a form of endurance that deserves recognition. It is worth remembering, too, that their role intersected with the broader rhythms of agriculture. The waste they carried did not simply vanish. It returned to the fields, enriching the soil that produced grain and vegetables. The gong farmer, in this sense, was part of the great cycle of sustenance, transforming what was rejected into what was necessary. The connection between the privy and the plow, unspoken and uncomfortable, was nonetheless real, and the gong farmer stood at its center. His buckets carried the stuff of life in its least appealing form, and yet from that filth grew food that sustained communities. In thinking of them now, there is a temptation to romanticize their resilience, to imagine a grim pride in doing the work that no one else would do. But the truth was likely less noble and more practical. Most gong farmers did the job because they had no other choice. Poverty, lack of opportunity, or simple inheritance forced them into it. Whatever dignity they might have claimed came not from the work itself, but from survival. The simple fact of enduring day after day in a world that gave them few alternatives. Still, even survival can hold a certain dignity. To face the filth, the insults, the loneliness, and yet to persist, to feed one's family. To carve out a place on the margins of society, this too is a form of strength. It may not shine like the armor of a knight or echo like the words of a scholar, but it is strength nonetheless. The gong farmer's endurance is part of the broader human story of survival against unappealing odds. The physical traces of their work are mostly gone now. Modern sanitation has buried their world beneath layers of pipes and drains. The pits they once emptied have been filled, the dumping grounds paved over, the night carts forgotten. What remains are scattered references in records, odd complaints in town ordinances, and the occasional archaeological discovery of cesspits still holding the waste of centuries. In those remains, scholars find evidence not only of diet and health but of the men who once climbed into those pits with buckets and ropes. Their fingerprints are not literal, but they linger in the margins of history. What then, is the legacy of the gong farmer. It is not fame or honor. It is not remembered names or celebrated deeds. Their legacy is simply the survival of towns, the continuity of communities, the endurance of urban life in an age before sewers. They carried away the waste so that others could carry on with their lives. They bore the burden that allowed society to function. Their reward was coin. Their punishment was stigma. Their memory was silence, yet in that silence lies a truth, that civilization is built not only on triumphs but also on labors too foul to speak of. The story of the gong farmer reminds us that history is not only the story of kings and battles, but also of ordinary men doing extraordinary tasks of endurance. They live in shadows, walked through filth, and bore insults, yet they kept the towns alive. They are a reminder that the foundations of society are often hidden, carried by those who receive little thanks. And so, when you think of the medieval city, bustling with merchants, echoing with church bells, bright with the colors of market stalls, remember to the man who walked at night with his cart of waste. Without him, the city would have choked on its own refuse. He is invisible in the chronicles, absent from the tapestries, forgotten in the songs, but he was there nonetheless, holding together the fragile fabric of urban life. In an age before telegraphs, before the printing press, before even the regularity of a reliable postal system, the voice of kings, bishops, merchants, and ordinary townsfolk traveled not through wires or ink pages, but through the feet of men. To send a message in the Middle Ages was not simply to write words and trust them to paper. It was to entrust them to a person who carried those words across miles of uncertain roads. These men were the messengers of the medieval world, often overlooked in chronicles but vital to the functioning of kingdoms, churches, and marketplaces. Without them, decisions could not be enforced, alliances could not be maintained, and communities could not communicate beyond their walls. The life of a messenger was neither glamorous nor secure. To the casual imagination, one might picture a swift courier racing across fields on horseback. But the reality was far more mundane. Many messengers traveled on foot, their loads heavy with letters, scrolls, or even verbal instructions committed to memory. Horses were expensive and not always available, especially for those working in service to a small town or monastery. A messenger walking from one village to another might spend days in the elements, trudging through mud in winter, dust in summer, or rain that soaked parchment and blurred the words he carried. Every journey carried risks: bandits on lonely roads, wolves in forests, or the simple misfortune of a twisted ankle that left him stranded. Messengers came from different backgrounds depending on who employed them. Royal messengers, tasked with carrying the commands of kings or the treaties of nobles, might be men of some standing, chosen for their loyalty and endurance. Monastic messengers, often monks themselves, carried correspondence between abbés, or between abbots and bishops, ensuring that the affairs of the church flowed as steadily as its prayers. Town messengers served local councils, delivering orders, announcements, and even summons to court. Then there were the countless unnamed men who carried personal letters, entrusted by merchants or families with the simple task of passing along words that mattered only to a few but were no less urgent in their own way. Payment for their work varied widely. A royal messenger might be well fed and lodged along his route, recognized by officials who knew the importance of the seal he bore. A poor messenger serving a village might earn little more than a crust of bread and a place on a straw mat for the night. Some were bound to their employers by duty rather than wages. A monk did not expect pay for carrying a letter between monasteries, nor did a retainer question his lord's command to ride with a message. But for those who made a trade of it, the work was one of constant travel, constant exposure, and constant risk, undertaken for modest but necessary reward. The routes they traveled revealed much about the world they inhabited. Roads in the Middle Ages were not always the paved and reliable paths we imagine today. Many were little more than tracks, worn by carts and animals, rutted and muddy after rains, choked with dust in dry seasons. Bridges were scarce, and rivers often had to be forded. In winter, Snow made progress slow and dangerous. To cross a forest was to enter a world of shadows and uncertainty, where outlaws might lurk and wild animals prowl. To pass through mountains was to test one's strength against the elements. Every mile of the journey carried its own hazards, and yet the messenger pressed on, for the words he carried were not his own to delay. The contents of those messages varied, but each was weighted with its own kind of importance. A royal command might alter the course of a province, ordering troops to muster or taxes to be levied. A bishop's letter might settle disputes of doctrine or dictate the observance of holy days. A merchant's instructions could mean the difference between profit and loss in trade. A personal letter, carried from one village to another, might contain news of a death, a marriage, or a request for aid. To the messenger, the contents were often unknown, sealed, and forbidden to open. But the burden of responsibility was still felt. Each scrap of parchment was the voice of another, placed in his care until it reached its destination. To be a messenger was also to be a stranger in many places, arriving in towns at odd hours, knocking on doors with urgent letters, standing at the edge of markets to read out proclamations. The messenger lived between communities rather than within them. Hospitality might be offered, but it was rarely warm. To strangers, he was both necessary and suspect, carrying news that might be welcome or unwelcome. At times, he was greeted with gratitude, at other times, with suspicion or hostility. The words he bore could stir joy or anger, and he himself bore the brunt of those reactions. It was not only the natural dangers of the road or the coldness of strangers that burdened his life, but also the suspicion that sometimes attached to his role. Messengers could be accused of altering letters, of losing them, or of favoring one party over another. A missing message could alter the outcome of disputes and in times of war. The capture or betrayal of a messenger could shift the course of events. For this reason, trust was everything. Employers chose men whose loyalty was proven, for a faithless messenger was worse than none at all. In extreme cases, a messenger who betrayed his trust might be punished harshly, even executed. For the words he carried could be as valuable as gold or as dangerous as weapons. Despite these challenges, the role of the messenger persisted because it was indispensable. Without them, rulers could not govern effectively, churches could not communicate across their vast networks, and towns could not function as coherent communities. The messenger was the thread that connected the scattered pieces of medieval life, binding together regions, institutions, and individuals through the simple act of carrying words. And yet, like the scribe or the gong farmer, his work was largely invisible. Chronicles recorded the letters of kings, but rarely the names of the men who delivered them. Monastic annals might note the arrival of correspondence, but not the weary monk who trudged through storms to bring it. The messenger was the shadow at the edge of the record, the necessary presence without whom nothing could proceed, but whose own story was seldom told. If you imagine him now, you might see a man trudging along a narrow road, his cloak pulled tight against the wind, a satchel slung across his chest, a seal dangling from a cord to mark the authority of his errand. He pauses at a stream, crouches to drink, and presses on, knowing that miles still lie ahead. Perhaps he will find shelter in a monastery before nightfall, or perhaps he will sleep in the woods, his back against a tree, his ears alert for sounds in the darkness. He is alone, but his solitude carries the weight of countless voices depending on him. The question that arises is not only how he endured these journeys, but what he thought of the messages he bore. Did he ever feel tempted to break a seal, to peek at the words that stirred such urgency in those who sent them? Did he ever feel resentment at being burdened with news that was not his own? Or did he take pride in being trusted with the lifeblood of communication, knowing that without him the world would fall silent? The life of the medieval messenger was not simply defined by the act of carrying words from one place to another, but by the countless obstacles encountered along the way. Each journey was a test of endurance, not only of the body but also of patience and spirit. The road stretched endlessly before him, and while others lived their lives within the boundaries of a single village, tending fields or working trades in familiar surroundings. The messenger's home was the path itself. He belonged nowhere, and his footsteps traced patterns across the land that few men of his station would ever see. Every day brought the wear of repetition. The messenger rose often before dawn, when the air was damp and heavy with mist, his legs already sore from yesterday's miles. He ate what little he could carry or what he had been given the night before. A crust of stale bread, perhaps, or a bit of cheese if fortune allowed, with no certainty of his next meal. He learned to make do with small rations and to walk on an empty stomach when necessary. Hunger became as common a companion as the satchel across his chest. On the road, his mind was occupied not with grand thoughts, but with a simple act of continuing forward. The body moved, step after step, while the eyes scanned the horizon for danger. A lone traveler was an easy mark for bandits, who haunted the edges of forests and watched for opportunities to strip a man of his possessions. For this reason, messengers often carried little of value besides the words entrusted to them, and yet even these could be precious enough to tempt thieves. A sealed letter from a nobleman might contain military orders or financial instructions, knowledge that could be sold to an enemy or used for advantage. To carry such letters made the messenger a target, though he had no weapon but his endurance and his hope of avoiding notice. Some messengers traveled in groups when possible, joining pilgrims, merchants, or soldiers on the same route. But this was not always available. When alone, the messenger learned to walk quickly, to keep to well-worn paths, and to avoid lingering in places where danger might be near. He carried not only the burden of his satchel but the weight of vigilance, never certain whether the next bend in the road would reveal a friendly traveler or a foe. Even the simple sound of snapping twigs in the forest could raise his pulse, though more often than not it was only a deer moving in the undergrowth. Exhaustion was constant. The roads were uneven, sometimes little more than muddy ruts filled with stagnant water. A horse, if one could be afforded, eased the distance but added the challenge of caring for the animal along the way. Most of the time, the messenger's own feet bore the punishment. Shoes were thin, and the leather cracked under constant exposure to wet and dry alike. Blisters formed, hardened, and broke again. In the depths of winter, frostbite was a danger. In summer, the heat burned the skin and drew insects that tormented the traveler endlessly. Still, he pressed forward, because a delay in his delivery was not merely an inconvenience, but an offense to those who had trusted him with their words. The expectation of speed was one of the cruelest burdens. To carry a letter was not only to deliver it intact, but to deliver it quickly. Time was measured not in hours, but in the urgency of events. A summons to battle, a warning of invasion, a command to prepare supplies. A messenger could not afford to dawdle, nor could he rest long even when his body cried out for sleep. Often, he walked until darkness made the road invisible, and even then he pressed on, guided by moonlight or the faint outlines of the path. Nights in the open were long and uneasy. The wind cut through thin cloaks, and the ground was hard beneath his bones. Yet sleep in towns and villages was not always safer, for suspicion clung to strangers, and a man arriving at odd hours with urgent letters might be seen as a spy or worse. The messenger's reputation depended entirely on his reliability. A single failure, a letter lost, a delay unexplained, a message delivered to the wrong hand, could end his livelihood. In times of war, such a mistake could even end his life. Trust was everything, and once broken, it was nearly impossible to restore. Employers looked for men who were not only strong of body but steady of character, able to resist temptation, fear, and fatigue alike. Some messengers swore oaths of loyalty, binding themselves by sacred words to deliver messages faithfully. Others carried tokens or seals that identified them as trusted couriers, though these were not always protection against suspicion. Even when the task was completed, the messenger rarely received more than modest thanks. He might be paid his fee or given his meal and sent back on the road again, his presence forgotten as soon as the letter was opened. No one celebrated the man who brought the words. The value lay entirely in the words themselves. To be a messenger was to be essential yet invisible, present only long enough to hand over what he carried before fading once more into the background. The satisfaction of the work lay not in recognition, but in survival, and in the small pride of knowing that he had kept his trust intact. Yet there were moments when the messenger must have felt the strangeness of his role. He held in his hands secrets he could not read, decisions that could change lives, news that might bring joy or despair. He was the silent bridge between sender and receiver, the living conduit of communication. And sometimes, he might have wondered how much of history passed quietly through his satchel. How many wars and treaties and marriages hinged on the safe arrival of the parchment tucked within. He could not know the full weight of it, but he must have felt some awareness that the world moved, in part, on his weary steps. It is easy to imagine the temptation that lurked. What if he did break a seal, just once, to see the contents? What if he whispered what he had read to another, trading knowledge for coin or favor? Some surely did, and their betrayals became cautionary tales that justified the mistrust shown to many messengers. Others remained steadfast, though they received little more than the basic sustenance of life in return. Trust was their only true wealth, and it was as fragile as the parchment they carried. So the messenger pressed on, day after day, mile after mile, across fields, forests, and mountains, through hunger, fatigue, suspicion, and fear. His life was a chain of errands, each forgotten as soon as it was completed, yet together forming the quiet, unseen web of connection that held the medieval world together. Without him, words could not travel, commands could not be obeyed, and communities could not know what lay beyond their own narrow borders. And yet, one must wonder what he thought, trudging endlessly forward with little rest, his body battered by the road and his spirit worn thin. Did he ever question why he carried so much for so little? Did he dream of a life rooted in one place, free of the burden of other men's words? Or did he accept his lot as simply the way the world was, walking on into the endless miles because there was no other path for him? The messenger's role, though often thankless, was woven so deeply into the structure of medieval life that it became impossible to imagine the world functioning without him. For centuries, men with little more than a satchel and their stamina connected castles, monasteries, courts, and villages. They were the silent arteries of communication, carrying not only words but the trust and stability of entire realms. Yet, like all aspects of medieval society, the life of the messenger did not remain unchanged. The burdens they carried shifted with the growth of kingdoms, the spread of literacy, and the slow transformations that reshaped Europe in the early Middle Ages. When roads were sparse and literacy rare, a messenger was often one of the few bridges between isolated places. His importance was magnified because written documents were scarce and oral messages common. A man might be chosen for his memory as much as his speed, tasked with carrying not parchment but words alone, repeated carefully until he reached his destination. In this way, he became not only a courier, but a vessel of memory, trusted to preserve sentences exactly as they were given. The slightest change could alter meaning, and so he bore within his mind as much weight as he did in his satchel. As centuries passed, the spread of written documents changed the nature of the work. Seals became symbols of authority, proof that the words within were genuine and unaltered. This increased the burden of protection. For to lose a sealed letter was to lose not only the message, but the authority it represented. The wax itself became a kind of treasure, pressed with the insignia of lords, bishops, or kings, and messengers guarded these tokens as carefully as gold. The greater the importance of seals and letters, the more dangerous the task of carrying them became, for enemies or opportunists knew their value. Over time, systems of messengers grew more organized. Royal households developed networks of trusted couriers, sometimes given distinctive badges or cloaks to mark their service. The church, too, established regular routes of communication, connecting abbeys across great distances and enabling councils and senates to function. Merchants created their own webs of correspondence, hiring men to carry letters along trade routes, ensuring that goods could be tracked and debts collected. Even towns developed official messengers, whose duties included not only carrying letters but proclaiming ordinances, calling citizens to meetings, and spreading news in the marketplace. In each case, the messenger stood at the threshold between private communication and public action, embodying the flow of information that held communities together. And yet, despite this growing structure, the messenger's life remained hard and uncertain. Payment was rarely generous, and the risks never diminished. Bandits continued to haunt the roads. Suspicion continued to shadow the solitary traveler, and hunger continued to gnaw at the man who walked with little more than a staff and cloak. The work was constant, and the recognition scarce. Even as their networks grew, messengers remained invisible in the chronicles, overshadowed by the words they carried rather than remembered for the burdens they endured. The introduction of more formal postal systems in later centuries began to change this pattern. In some regions, noble families and kingdoms established relay stations where fresh horses and riders could continue a message at speed, reducing the strain on any single man. These systems offered more reliability, but they also pushed aside the humble individual messenger, who could not compete with the efficiency of organized relays. By the late Middle Ages, the seeds of what would become permanent postal services were already taking root, and the solitary figure trudging across lonely miles was gradually replaced by more structured means of communication. Still, even as formal systems developed, the need for trusted individuals remained. Important letters, sensitive negotiations, or dangerous missions could not always be entrusted to a system. There were always moments when a lord or a bishop looked to one man, swore him to secrecy, and handed him a sealed letter to carry across dangerous terrain. In such moments, the ancient image of the solitary messenger lived on, unchanged despite the march of progress. For every organized relay, there was still the figure of a weary man walking alone, bearing words that could not be delayed or entrusted to another. The personal toll of such a life must have been heavy. The constant travel pulled men away from family and community, leaving them rootless in a world where belonging was everything. To live always on the road was to live always on the edge of other people's lives, passing through without settling. The messenger might be recognized by a few along his route, but rarely did he have a place to call home. His identity was bound not to land or craft, but to the transient duty of carrying words. In this sense, he lived between worlds, necessary, but seldom fully part of the society he served. As centuries passed and communication grew faster, the role of the medieval messenger faded further into obscurity. His work was absorbed into larger systems, his individuality lost. Where once a single man's reliability determined whether a message reached its destination, now networks of couriers, posts, and eventually technologies would take his place. By the time of the Renaissance, with the spread of printing and the formalization of postal services, the solitary messenger was more a relic of the past than a figure of the present. His era had ended quietly, without fanfare, his labor swallowed by the progress of history. Yet if his name was forgotten, his influence was not. The messages he carried, unrecorded by his own hand, shaped the course of kingdoms and communities. Wars were fought or avoided because of his timely arrival. Marriages were arranged or canceled because of the words he delivered. Markets rose or fell on news born in his satchel. In countless ways, he was a silent architect of history, his weary footsteps laying the foundation for the interconnected world that would follow. Without him, the threads of medieval life would have frayed, and the fabric of society might have unraveled. Looking back, one cannot help but reflect on the paradox of his existence. He was essential yet invisible, burdened yet unnoticed, trusted yet often distrusted. He embodied both the fragility and resilience of human communication. Fragile, because a single misstep could destroy the trust placed in him. Resilient, because despite all dangers, he continued to walk, to endure, and to deliver. His story is not one of glory, but of persistence, a reminder that history is built not only on the deeds of kings and warriors, but on the quiet labor of men who carried words across the miles. In our own time, when messages travel instantly across the globe, it is easy to forget what it once meant to send a word to another. We press a button and watch as our thoughts appear before distant eyes, the labor invisible, the journey instantaneous. But once, not so long ago, each message required flesh and bone to carry it, required footsteps through mud and snow, required the risk of hunger and harm. To remember the medieval messenger is to remember the cost of communication, the human endurance that made every word possible. And so, as the image fades of the weary man on the road, cloak pulled tight against the wind, satchel heavy on his shoulder, it leaves behind the quiet reflection. How many lives were touched by words he carried? How much history moved forward on the strength of his weary legs? And how often do we, who live in a world of instant messages, pause to think of those who once bore the burden of every word? In the Middle Ages, candle making was a craft as thankless as it was essential. To the average townsfolk, the work of the chandler was a mystery best left unconsidered, for the process smelled far too foul to romanticize. It was not a trade that carried admiration, nor was it one that brought ease. Instead, it was a craft defined by endurance, repetition, and the acceptance of discomfort, both for those who made candles and for those who relied upon them. The workshop of a medieval chandler was not an inviting place. Step inside, and you would be met with the heavy odor of fat, the air thick with smoke from simmering vats. Great cauldrons of tallow boiled over open fires, their greasy steam clinging to everything. Wooden poles hung with wicks dipped and redipped into the molten fat, forming the rows of candles that would light homes and churches. The floor was slick with spills, scraps of hardened fat stuck in corners, and buckets of cooling grease stood about, waiting to be poured into molds or used for another round of dipping. The work itself carried hazards beyond the stench. Boiling fat could easily splatter, scalding skin. The open flames needed to melt tallow were ever present risks in a workshop, filled with combustible materials. Smoke irritated the eyes and lungs, and workers coughed as they stirred vats hour after hour. Many candle makers bore scars from burns or carried the rasp of long-term smoke inhalation. Yet such dangers were simply part of the occupation, accepted as unavoidable in the pursuit of a living. Even beyond the walls of their workshop, candle makers carried the mark of their trade. The odor of tallow clung stubbornly to skin and clothing. Townsfolk, especially those unaccustomed to such smells, often wrinkled their noses when a chandler walked past. In marketplaces, they might be given a wide berth. While chandlers provided a service essential to everyone, they were also known as the people who smelled of fat. It was a reputation they could not escape, no matter how carefully they washed. For the chandlers, children, this sometimes meant teasing or exclusion. A reminder that even useful trades could bring social stigma. Yet stigma did not make their work less necessary. In fact, the demand for light only grew as medieval life became more complex. Towns grew busier. Monasteries produced more manuscripts, and urban households sought comfort in evenings that no longer ended at dusk. The chandler's shop remained busy, despite the muttered comments about smell. Every order, large or small, meant survival for the family, and so they endured the discomfort, clinging to the knowledge that without them, darkness would close in much sooner. Inside the home, the use of candles was always carefully rationed. A wealthy merchant might allow several candles to burn at once, illuminating his table while he entertained guests. But for the poor, one candle might have to suffice for the entire family. It was placed in the center of the room, and all activity gathered around it: sewing, mending tools, telling stories, eating, or saying prayers. Once the candle was extinguished, the family retired to bed, whether or not sleep had come. To waste a candle was to waste money, and so its flame was treated with near reverence. In churches, candles took on a different meaning, their light symbolic as much as practical. Altars gleamed with rows of beeswax candles, while the faithful placed offerings of smaller candles before statues and shrines. The chandler's work here was elevated, for it became part of the sacred. A candle offered in prayer might burn long after the worshiper had left, a small flame carrying their devotion upward. But behind that moment of spiritual beauty lay the same greasy labor, the same endless dipping of wicks into boiling fat or expensive wax. The holiness of the candle did not erase the mundanity of its making. Guilds, too, played a role in shaping the life of the candle maker in larger towns. Chandlers often belonged to organizations that regulated prices, controlled competition, and set standards. Guild membership offered some protection and status, but it also brought obligations, fees, adherence to rules, and participation in civic duties. For smaller-scale chandlers, guilds could be restrictive, limiting their ability to experiment with cheaper blends or to sell outside approved markets. Yet without guild membership, a chandler might struggle to secure customers, for guilds had the power to advertise themselves as the guarantors of quality. There were also divisions within the craft itself. Makers of tallow candles were often looked down upon by those who worked with beeswax, whose product was more refined and more lucrative. Beeswax chandlers could avoid much of the stench that clung to their tallow-making counterparts, and their clientele was wealthier, more influential. In many towns, the beeswax chandler occupied a higher social tier than the tallow chandler, even though both produced light. This division mirrored the broader gulf between rich and poor. Some could afford the sweetness of beeswax, while others endured the sour smoke of tallow. For the chandler, survival depended on more than just making candles. It required connections with butchers to secure animal fat, with merchants to acquire flax or hemp for wicks, and with customers to ensure steady sales. Each step carried challenges. Fat spoiled quickly, if not rendered properly, leading to foul-smelling candles that smoked badly. Wicks that were too thick or too thin could cause uneven burning. Customers were quick to complain if their candles guttered out too soon. A reputation for poor quality could ruin a chandler, leaving him with unsold stock and unpaid debts. The economic side of candle making was as unforgiving as the physical labor. Profit margins were slim, and prices fluctuated with the supply of animals or beeswax. During times of famine or disease, when herds dwindled, fat became scarce and expensive. In such years, chandlers struggled to maintain production, their families enduring hardship as supplies ran thin. Meanwhile, wealthy institutions like monasteries often secured what supplies remained, leaving little for smaller producers. The candle maker's livelihood, though steady in ordinary years, could collapse in times of crisis. And yet, despite the hardships, candle makers endured. The rhythm of dipping, cooling, and selling defined their days. The smell of tallow marked their lives, and the glow of their candles marked the lives of others. Their craft was not one of prestige, but it was one of necessity, and in that necessity lay a quiet kind of dignity. Still, one cannot help but wonder about the personal feelings of the chandler himself. Did he resent the smell that drove others away? Or did he take pride in the light his hands produced? Did he envy the beeswax chandlers with their cleaner workshops and richer customers? Or did he see their trade as distant from the real needs of the people? And in the darkest nights of winter, when his own family huddled around a single candle, did he ever reflect on the irony that the supplier of light often lived on the edge of darkness himself? By the close of the Middle Ages, candle making had already begun to shift, slowly but inevitably. The humble tallow candle, once the only affordable light for most households, remained a staple well into the early modern period. Yet alternatives began to appear, signaling changes in both technology and society. The story of the candle maker is therefore not just about a single trade, but about the way necessity, invention, and human endurance shape the most basic of human needs, light in the dark. For centuries, the reliance on tallow reflected the realities of a subsistence economy. People used what was available and animals provided both food and fat. But as trade expanded and wealth accumulated, alternatives grew more accessible. Beeswax, long the preserve of the church and nobility, trickled down to wealthier merchants and guild leaders. To burn beeswax in one's home was not just a matter of light, but of status. It said something about a household's prosperity, its ability to afford comfort and refinement beyond the reach of most. The chandler who worked with beeswax thus found himself in a more privileged position than his tallow-focused counterpart, even though the skills required were nearly identical. Another subtle change came with the rise of imported oils. Olive oil had long been used for lamps in southern Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean. While northern regions lacked the climate to grow olives, trade routes brought oil across the continent. Oil lamps provided an alternative to candles, though they required steady supplies and careful tending. In wealthy urban centers, lamps gradually joined candles as sources of evening light, though the poor still relied on their familiar tallow. The 17th century would later bring innovations such as spermaceti candles, made from the waxy substance found in the head of sperm whales. These burned brighter, cleaner, and with less odor than tallow, quickly becoming the choice of the elite. But such developments lay far in the future of the medieval chandler, who could scarcely imagine a world in which distant oceans provided the raw material for household light. For him, fat from the butcher's shop and beeswax from local beekeepers were the limits of possibility. Yet even within these boundaries, the work of candle makers carried quiet importance. Without their labor, the rhythms of daily and sacred life would have faltered. Monks copying manuscripts by candlelight preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Families gathering around a single flame shared stories and warmth that bound them together. Towns and villages depended on chandlers not because their trade was glamorous, but because it was indispensable still. The invisibility of their labor raises a question. Why do we remember the cathedrals that glowed with candles, but not the men and women who made them? History has a way of celebrating the visible and forgetting the ordinary. The soaring architecture of a church endures. The shimmering glow of beeswax candles is recorded in chronicles, but the tallow-stained hands that dip wick after wick are absent from most accounts. Yet it is precisely these forgotten labors that sustain medieval life. The chandler's workshop, with its foul odor and constant smoke, was as much a part of the medieval world as the marketplace or the castle. To imagine the life of a candle maker is to glimpse a truth about survival. That progress depends not on grand moments, but on daily endurance. The chandler did not create wealth or win battles. He did not shape kingdoms or inspire art. Instead, he stood at the edge of history, producing the small but vital flames that allowed others to do those things. His contribution was invisible, yet essential. Without him, scholars could not have read, priests could not have prayed, families could not have extended their evenings. In a sense, every candle he made carried within it a fraction of history itself. The irony, of course, is that the candle maker himself often lived in shadow. His work was bound by regulations. His social status was middling at best, and his family endured the smell and stigma of tallow. His trade did not enrich him, nor did it shield him from hardship. And yet, his life reveals the hidden backbone of medieval society, the countless men and women whose labor sustained the visible world. Their names are lost, but their word burned brightly in every flame that lit the dark. By the end of the medieval period, guilds had formalized the craft of candle making more firmly. Some towns had separate guilds for tallow chandlers and wax chandlers, reinforcing the divide between the trades. Apprentices learned the techniques of dipping, molding, and purifying, often enduring years of labor before earning the right to sell under their own name. Candle making became a profession with rules and traditions, yet it never quite shed its association with unpleasant smells and unglamorous toil. The introduction of glass lanterns and holders offered small improvements. A candle enclosed in glass burned more evenly and with less smoke, protecting homes from soot. Wealthier households adopted such devices adding refinement to their evenings. Still, for most people, a simple wooden holder sufficed, and the candle's flame sputtered and smoked as it always had. The experience of light in the Middle Ages remained fragile, inconsistent, and limited, a reminder of how dependent life was on the chandler's skill. The eventual shift away from tallow and beeswax did not erase the centuries of labor that preceded it. When gas lamps and, later, electric bulbs transformed the night, the candle became a symbol rather than a necessity. It lingered in religious ritual and ceremony, in moments of remembrance or romance. But its role as the foundation of evening life faded, and with it faded the importance of the chandler. The profession, once vital, dwindled until it became a curiosity of history. And yet, the story of the candle maker offers more than nostalgia. It teaches something about endurance in the face of unglamorous work. The chandler's life reminds us that history is not built only by kings and conquerors, but by those who perform the repetitive, uncelebrated tasks that make survival possible. To render fat into light is not heroic, but it is human. It reveals the persistence of people who lived in a dark world and found a way to push it back, if only by a flickering flame. Perhaps that is why, even now, the simple act of lighting a candle carries meaning. It recalls the countless hands that once did the same, not for beauty or ritual, but for survival. It reminds us of the long centuries when the fall of night meant true darkness, broken only by the labor of chandlers who endured smoke, smell, and stigma to keep the world glowing faintly after sundown. So the story closes not with triumph, but with reflection. The medieval candle maker, anonymous in history, worked tirelessly in a craft that sustained everyone else. His trade has vanished, but the flame he tended still lingers, small and steady. In every candle we light today, in the medieval town, narrow streets twisted between wooden houses, their upper floors leaning out as though trying to meet each other across the road. Waste trickled in open gutters, the air heavy with the mingled scents of animals, cooking fires, and human life packed closely together. To live in such a place was to live in contact with dirt. And though modern imagination often conjures an image of unwashed peasants, the truth was more complex. People desired cleanliness, warmth, and comfort just as much then as now. For many, the solution was not a private tub at home, but the public bathhouse. The bathhouse was a fixture of medieval towns across much of Europe, particularly in regions influenced by Roman traditions of bathing. In cities like Paris, London, or Nuremberg, bathhouses could be found near marketplaces, along rivers, or tucked into side streets, their chimneys pouring out steam and smoke from the stoves that heated water. These establishments were not grand like the Roman baths of antiquity, but they served a similar purpose, a place where ordinary people could wash, soak, and, for a time, escape the grime of daily life. For most households, heating large quantities of water was impractical. Firewood was expensive, and carrying water from wells or rivers was laborious. A family might manage a small wash at home, but a full bath required more resources than many could spare. The bathhouse solved this problem by centralizing the work. Large cauldrons heated over roaring fires supplied hot water, which attendants poured into wooden tubs. Dozens of such tubs filled a single room, steam rising and condensing on the beams overhead. Bathing was not a solitary act in these spaces. Men and women often bathed together, at least in the earlier Middle Ages, though later regulations in some towns attempted to enforce separation. Families, couples, and groups of friends might rent a tub, sitting together in warm water, talking, laughing, and eating. Some bathhouses even offered meals delivered to the tubs, along with wine or ale. To the medieval bather, the experience was not only hygienic but social, a time to relax and converse away from the press of work. The atmosphere of a bathhouse could be lively. Attendants moved constantly, carrying buckets of hot water, stoking fires, or bringing trays of food. The air was filled with the sound of conversation, splashing water, and the creak of wooden tubs. For the poor, a visit to the bathhouse was a rare luxury, perhaps enjoyed only on feast days or special occasions. For the wealthier, it could be a regular habit, one that provided not only cleanliness but also a display of prosperity. To be seen at the bathhouse, clean and refreshed, was a subtle signal of one's ability to afford what others could not. Of course, not all bathhouses were equal. Some were little more than rough sheds with a few tubs and a smoky fire, catering to laborers and peasants. Others were elaborate establishments, with multiple rooms, private chambers, and services beyond bathing. In some towns, bathhouses became centers of hospitality, offering massages, music, and even lodging. The line between respectable bathing and disreputable indulgence blurred, and bathhouses gained a mixed reputation, places of health and sociability, but also of temptation and scandal. The church watched the bathhouse with suspicion. On the one hand, it recognized the value of cleanliness and the relief that warm water provided for weary bodies. On the other hand, the mingling of men and women, often unclothed or lightly covered, raised concerns about morality. Sermons warned against the sins of immodesty and lust that could arise in such places, and in some towns, clergy pressed for greater regulation. Rules were issued requiring separate hours for men and women, though enforcement varied. Still, the bathhouse endured because it met a need too great to ignore. Medical thought of the time also supported bathing within reason. Physicians advised that warm water could open the pores, release harmful humors, and restore balance to the body. Bathing was recommended for certain ailments, though always with caution. Too much immersion was thought to weaken the flesh or invite illness. Herbal infusions were sometimes added to the water, thought to heal or refresh. The bathhouse thus became a place not only of relaxation, but also of rudimentary health care, where people sought relief from aches, fevers, or the fatigue of labor. To step into a medieval bathhouse, then, was to enter a different rhythm of life. Outside, the streets were noisy and foul, but inside, there was warmth, light, and water. For a brief time, a laborer could forget the weight of toil. A merchant could enjoy company beyond his shop, and a traveler could wash away the dust of the road. The experience carried with it the scent of steam, the creak of timbers, and the comfort of heat soaking into tired muscles. It was, in its way, as much a communal ritual as attending church or market. Yet the bathhouse also reveals the paradox of medieval cleanliness. People valued it and pursued it, but their means were limited. A visit to the bathhouse might be occasional, not daily, and clothing absorbed sweat and smoke between washings. For many, the bathhouse offered the illusion of escape from dirt, more than its eradication. Still, that illusion mattered. It gave people a sense of dignity, of being refreshed and renewed, even if the streets outside quickly restored their grime. As centuries passed, the reputation of bathhouses shifted. Where once they were seen as places of communal health, they increasingly drew suspicion as sites of immorality. The line between bathing and pleasure blurred further in some towns, with prostitution becoming a hidden or even open feature of certain establishments. Authorities attempted to regulate or close such bathhouses, though often unsuccessfully, for the demand remained. The tension between necessity and temptation, between cleanliness and corruption, marked the bathhouse as a complex institution, one that reflected both the needs and the contradictions of medieval life. And so, the bathhouse stands as a reminder that medieval people were not indifferent to hygiene, nor were they resigned to perpetual filth. They sought warmth, comfort, and cleanliness where they could, often turning to the bathhouse as their best option. To dismiss them as dirty peasants is to miss the truth that even in the shadow of narrow streets and crowded homes, people value the simple relief of hot water and the shared experience of being clean. But the question remains, as bathhouses grew in number and popularity, Did they truly represent a step toward greater hygiene? Or did they simply provide a fleeting comfort that masked the deeper struggles of living in a world where dirt was inescapable? The medieval bathhouse occupied a curious place in society, balanced between acceptance and suspicion. For many, it was a source of comfort, warmth, and refreshment, yet for others, especially among the clergy and civic authorities, it was a space where the boundaries of modesty blurred and the risks of indulgence loomed too large to ignore. The very same features that made bathhouses appealing, communal bathing, mixed company, food, and drink, also made them targets of regulation and critique. In towns like Paris, Nuremberg, and London, bathhouses were often subject to municipal oversight. City records show attempts to control their opening hours, to separate men and women, or to limit the sale of alcohol within their walls. Authorities were well aware that bathing establishments doubled as places of social gathering, sometimes with reputations extending into outright brothels. Regulations therefore aimed to preserve the image of cleanliness and public health while curbing what officials saw as moral disorder. Clergy were especially vocal in their criticism. Sermons warned parishioners of the dangers of temptation in the steamy atmosphere of the baths. To sit unclothed in the company of others, they argued, was to invite sin. Even if the stated purpose was health, the mingling of genders became a particular focus of condemnation. In some towns, bathhouses responded by offering separate hours for men and women, or by erecting partitions, though the effectiveness of such measures varied. What one generation accepted as normal, another condemned as scandalous, and the bathhouse lived constantly under this shifting moral shadow. At the same time, physicians continued to defend bathing as a remedy for certain ailments. Medical texts of the Middle Ages often recommended warm baths for fever, digestive troubles, or fatigue, provided the patient observed moderation. Too hot a bath or too long a soak was thought to weaken the body. But taken in proper measure, bathing was believed to restore humoral balance. Some bathhouses even advertised their healing waters, infusing tubs with herbs such as rosemary, sage, or chamomile. In regions with natural hot springs, establishments grew into centers of health pilgrimage, where people sought cures for chronic pain or skin diseases. The contradictions deepened when plague swept across Europe. During outbreaks of the Black Death in the 14th century and later epidemics, authorities often blamed bathhouses as sites of contagion. The logic was simple: hot water opened the pores, making the body more vulnerable to bad airs or miasma. Communal tubs brought people into close contact, increasing the spread of disease. Civic leaders shuttered bathhouses in times of plague, and for many, this marked the beginning of their decline. What once symbolized health and renewal became associated with danger and death. Yet closing bathhouses did not erase the human desire for cleanliness. Instead, it drove people back to smaller, private arrangements, washing at home in basins, wiping with cloths, or heating small amounts of water when they could afford the firewood. For the poor, this meant a return to more limited hygiene, while the wealthy gradually built private baths within their homes. The decline of the public bathhouse, then, reflected not only the fear of disease but also a broader shift toward privatization of comfort. Despite these challenges, many bathhouses continued to operate, adapting to the times. Some emphasized their respectability, advertising themselves as places of family bathing or medical treatment, rather than indulgence. Others leaned into their reputation as sites of pleasure, offering music, games, and sexual services alongside bathing. The divergence widened until the word bathhouse could mean either a respectable establishment or a thinly disguised brothel, depending on where one stepped. The economic role of bathhouses should not be overlooked. They employed attendants, laundresses, fire tenders, cooks, and sometimes musicians. They purchased firewood in large quantities, creating a small but steady demand in urban economies. They rented tubs, provided food and drink, and often charged fees scaled to the wealth of the customer. For towns, They generated revenue through taxes or licensing. The bathhouse was therefore not only a cultural phenomenon, but also a business, tied to the ebb and flow of urban prosperity. Socially, the bathhouse served as a leveler, at least to some extent. Within its walls, people of different classes might find themselves in adjacent tubs. A merchant, a craftsman, and a journeyman laborer might share the same steam-filled room, if not the same tub. While wealth still dictated privacy and service, richer clients could rent separate chambers or request special attention. The communal atmosphere blurred lines that were otherwise rigidly maintained in medieval society. In that sense, the bathhouse carried a faint echo of the Roman tradition, where bathing had been both a necessity and a form of civic life. The experience of bathing was also sensory in ways that left an impression. The heat of the water, the smell of steam mixed with herbs, the crackle of the firewood, and the chatter of voices created a world apart from the cold and noise outside. For a medieval laborer, who might spend days in mud, sweat, and toil, stepping into that space was transformative, even if only temporary. It provided relief and dignity, a reminder that life was not entirely defined by dirt and exhaustion. And yet, that relief carried its own risks. Too much indulgence in the bathhouse, drinking heavily, spending lavishly on services, or visiting too often, was seen as a sign of weakness or moral failing. Satirical writings sometimes mocked men who squandered their earnings at the bathhouse or women who used it as an excuse for frivolity. To bathe was acceptable, even praiseworthy. To make bathing a habit of luxury was suspect. Once again, the bathhouse existed in tension, neither wholly virtuous nor wholly condemned, but caught between necessity and temptation. By the late Middle Ages, this tension tilted increasingly toward suspicion as plague returned in waves, as moral reform movements swept through the church, and as private bathing became more feasible for the wealthy. The communal bathhouse lost much of its earlier respectability. Some towns saw them disappear entirely, while in others, they survived but with diminished prestige. The image of the bathhouse shifted from a place of health to a place of risk, from social gathering to secret indulgence, and so, the bathhouse stands as a mirror of medieval society itself, a blend of practicality and suspicion, of health and temptation, of community and division. It reveals the desires of ordinary people for cleanliness and comfort, but also the fears of authorities about morality and disease. It was a place where laughter echoed against steaming beams, but also where preachers warned souls might be lost. The question that lingers is whether the decline of the public bathhouse represented a true loss for medieval society, or merely a shift in how people approached the eternal struggle with dirt, disease, and desire. Was something essential lost when the warm, communal tubs cooled into silence? Or did society simply find new ways to pursue the same comfort in private? By the late 15th century, the glow of the bathhouse was beginning to dim. For generations, it had been a symbol of warmth, relief, and fleeting escape from the grime of medieval life. Yet as Europe shifted into a new age of fear, reform, and changing notions of health, the once vibrant bathhouse fell into decline. Its steaming tubs, once crowded with laughter and chatter, became more often associated with sickness, scandal, or shame. The repeated waves of plague played no small role in this transformation. Each outbreak brought renewed suspicion toward public gathering spaces and bathhouses, with their heat and close contact, were considered especially dangerous. The idea that hot water opened the body as pores to invading bad airs gained popularity, reinforced by physicians seeking explanations for the spread of disease. While some doctors still recommended bathing for specific ailments, the prevailing caution was to avoid public baths during epidemics. Municipal closures often followed, and many establishments never reopened once the fear passed. At the same time, moral reformers doubled their efforts to curb what they saw as the dangerous temptations of the bathhouse. Preachers warned that indulgence in warm water softened not only the flesh but the will, To share a bath with members of the opposite sex, they argued, was to invite sin. As reform movements swept across Christendom, especially in the late medieval and early modern periods, the communal bathhouse became increasingly difficult to defend. Civic authorities, eager to align with religious guidance, imposed stricter regulations or quietly allowed establishments to vanish. The rise of private bathing further hastened this decline. Wealthy households began to install their own bathing facilities, whether in the form of wooden tubs filled by servants or small dedicated chambers with heated water. For the rich, the bathhouse was no longer a necessity. It was an inconvenience, a space shared with those of lower status. Privacy became a new marker of refinement, and with it, the idea that cleanliness should be pursued within the home rather than in public. This shift left the bathhouse serving mostly the poor and the middling sort, who could not afford such luxuries. As its clientele narrowed, so did its prestige. By the 16th century, in many parts of Europe, the once common bathhouse had become rare. In some towns, they lingered on the margins, tolerated as places of vice or remembered only as relics of an earlier age. In others, they disappeared entirely, leaving little trace beyond the names of streets or the scattered references in civic records. What had once been a vital part of urban life quietly slipped into memory. Yet the story of the bathhouse does not end simply with disappearance. Its legacy continued in subtler ways. The association between bathing and health never fully vanished. In regions blessed with natural hot springs, spa towns rose to prominence, drawing nobles and commoners alike in search of cures. These spas were heirs to the bathhouse tradition, though they carried a new image, not the noisy communal tubs of medieval towns, but the ordered, medicalized environment of early modern health resorts. The desire for warmth, water, and healing endured even as its forms changed. The bathhouse also left its imprint on cultural memory. For centuries after their decline, writers and moralists continued to reference them, often as symbols of indulgence or moral weakness. In literature, the bathhouse could stand for temptation, secrecy, or decline, a shorthand for pleasures that led to downfall. Yet in everyday speech, the longing for the warmth and comfort of the bath never disappeared. The tension between need and suspicion lived on in attitudes toward bathing itself. One of the more curious outcomes of this shift was the European tendency, especially in the 17th century, to distrust water as a means of cleaning. For a time, many preferred to wash only parts of the body with cloths, fearing that immersion in water might cause illness. Perfumes, powders, and changes of linen were relied upon to preserve a sense of cleanliness. In this way, the decline of the bathhouse not only removed a communal institution, but also altered the very meaning of hygiene. What had once been an act of immersion and refreshment became, for a period, a matter of surface treatment and disguise. And yet, the memory of the bathhouse continued to whisper of another possibility. When modern bathing culture began to reemerge in the 18th and 19th centuries, with private bathrooms in homes, the growth of public bathhouses for the working poor, and the expansion of spa culture, it did so in conversation with this medieval past. The longing for warm water, for relief from dirt and labor, was too deeply human to vanish. It resurfaced, reshaped by new technologies and new ideas, but still carrying echoes of the medieval steam-filled rooms. To imagine the final years of the medieval bathhouse is to picture a building at odds with its time. The beams darkened by smoke, the tubs patched from years of use, the fire crackling beneath heavy cauldrons, all of it endured, but with fewer visitors, more suspicion, and growing unease. The laughter was quieter, the chatter more subdued. A place once filled with community became instead a site of worry, where every cough or shiver might be blamed on the very waters meant to heal. And yet, to the man or woman who still stepped into its warmth, the experience must have carried the same relief it always had. For the washerwoman, whose hands were raw from soap, and cold water for the apprentice, who had carried loads through muddy streets for the old man, whose joints ached in winter. Despite, the bathhouse still offered something precious. Whatever moralists and physicians declared, the body knew the comfort of warmth and water. Even as the bathhouse declined, it lingered in memory as a place where, for a brief time, life was softened. What, then, does the story of the medieval bathhouse tell us? It reveals the constant push and pull between human needs and societal fears. The need for cleanliness, warmth, and rest was undeniable, but the fear of disease, the suspicion of indulgence, and the rising value of privacy gradually outweighed those needs in the communal form. In its decline, the bathhouse left a vacuum, one that would only be filled centuries later with the rise of modern sanitation. In reflecting on this, one wonders, did the medieval world lose something essential when the doors of the bathhouse closed, or did it simply find another path toward the same end? Perhaps both are true. The communal bathhouse represented not just washing, but a shared acknowledgement of the human need for care. Its disappearance marked not only a change in hygiene, but a change in how people imagined themselves in relation to others. And so, when we think of the bathhouse today, we might remember not only the dirt and disease that hastened its decline, but also the moments of laughter, warmth, and relief it once provided. It was, in its way, a reminder that even in an age of hardship and suspicion, people sought comfort together. The bathhouse may have cooled, but the desire it served has never gone cold.